In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the infantrymen formed the backbone of every modern army. The cavalry and artillery played their own roles, but neither were as large nor as flexible as the infantry. Whether they be in the open fields, rocky defiles, or the streets and walls of a city. The role of the infantry changed dramatically since the waning days of pike and shot. Now was the time for a more evolved style of warfare, one that would last for more than 2 centuries. As is the case in other wars, innovations in weaponry greatly influenced the tactics of the day. By the 1680s, armies began swapping the majority of their pikes and matchlocks for flintlock muskets. Flintlocks reloaded twice as fast, were easier to train recruits on, and coincided with a new invention, the bayonet. The first widely used variant of the bayonet was the plug bayonet, which allowed infantrymen to dish out both firepower and defense in close quarters fighting. However, some armies, such as the Swedish service, retained a small, but fair number of pikemen into the 1710s. The plug bayonet wasn't without faults, however. When fixed, a soldier could not return fire. Secondly, it tended to either get jammed in the barrel or otherwise fall out. The need for innovation led to the socket bayonet, which locked onto the barrel instead, allowing infantry to fire with bayonet fixed. Perhaps the bayonet's most famous use against infantry was in the charge, a unit slowly advancing with bayonets fixed toward the enemy, then at a closer distance running at full speed together to break an enemy formation. It should be noted that contrary to popular belief, bayonet-on-bayonet combat was rare. A charge's goal was rarely to engage in drawn-out melee, but instead complement the psychological effect of hundreds or thousands of men hurling toward an enemy soldier. This was enough to provoke a hasty retreat, or rout. The way units were organized also evolved. The infantry of the time were organized similarly to their predecessors. The standard infantry unit was the battalion. A battalion was part of a parent unit, either a regiment or a brigade. Some regiments only had a single battalion. Others, like the French King's Regiment, had 4. At full strength on campaign, a battalion probably possessed somewhere between 600 or 800 men, depending on the condition. These battalions consisted of at least several or more subunits known as companies, which were further divided into 2 or 4 platoons. However, most field actions were not performed lower than at the company level. There were also larger formations, like corps, which typically parented divisions, which in turn parented brigades. But these formations were not as consistent or standardized as they would become during the time of Napoleon. A battalion consisted of 2 main unit types, fusiliers and grenadiers. Fusiliers were the standard line infantry, reliable and large in number. Secondly, most battalions had at least 1 company of grenadiers. Grenadiers were first introduced in the French army of 1667, and were composed of the most elite troops of the regiment. Initially, these soldiers specialized in throwing various hand grenades, which with their short fuses were cumbersome and dangerous to light and fling, especially when under fire. Some grenadier units still carried grenades into the 18th century, but most armies abandoned the practice due to the advances in musketry. Thus, grenadiers kept a more elite status. In battle, battalions fought mostly in large, multi-line formations, familiar with those decently versed in later wars. To a present-day observer used to modern tactics, this might seem like an odd way to fight. Why would soldiers willingly present themselves as such an obvious target? The most popular explanation is that flintlock muskets are inaccurate at medium to long range, so a large number of men firing at once was necessary to inflict greater physical and psychological damage on the enemy. Formations were also essential in maintaining command and control. In the heat of battle, it was already difficult enough to hear orders, whether they be shouted or sounded by instruments like drums, trumpets, and bugles. One can imagine communication being nigh impossible with 600 men spread out over a long distance in squads without the technology. At higher levels, linear doctrine greatly aided field commanders in being able to discern their forces on the field more easily. Cavalry also posed a serious threat to the infantry. When charged from the front, a formation could easily disperse the enemy horsemen at little cost, or offer protection with a wall of steel bayonets. Soldiers caught in loose order made for easier prey. In essence, the importance of maintaining formations allowed for greater firepower, more effective command and control, and protection against cavalry. The way musketeers exchanged fire began to evolve as well. During the War of the Spanish Succession, the main method of firing was to do so together en masse, known as volley fire. If done right, a few of them, or even just one or two, could break or halt an enemy formation. Early in the war, two schools of volley fire met on the battlefield: the French method of firing by ranks, and the Anglo-Dutch method of platoon fire. Firing by ranks involved the first, second, and third rank, or lines, firing in succession. How many ranks actually fired varies, but it is noted that since the French battalions were typically 5 men deep, the rear men, forming at least 1 or 2 ranks, would not, or could not, give fire in return. Platoon fire was executed by a battalion, split into 4 grand divisions, with 4 small platoons each. Each platoon fired in turn, giving less weight in musketry, however, creating a continuous rolling fire down the line, offering no respite to the enemy. Firing by ranks suffered from soldiers naturally firing in haste, as an entire rank firing quickly all at once might encourage. The French method typically required the front ranks to kneel, making reloading more difficult and slower with the cumbersome muskets. In Marlborough's army, all ranks were used when firing, as his battalions were regulated to a 3-rank formation, allowing all of the men to fire. Eventually, other Allied armies, such as the Habsburg Imperial Army, adopted the practice. Even many French colonels had their regiments adopt the training. But due to the conservative nature of the Bourbon army, it was never officialized into any drill manual. The superiority of platoon fire was demonstrated in Flanders, but did not always live up to its reputation in other theaters, such as Spain and Portugal. As mentioned earlier, a formed battalion can easily repel any cavalry attack from the front, but formations often find themselves under attack from the flanks and rear. The only hope for a battalion was to form a defensive square. At least 4 grand divisions of a battalion wheeled in the necessary direction to form it. This was a very complicated maneuver, but if pulled off with good timing, could stave off any mounted charge. However, one trade-off of forming square is that it presented a larger target for artillery. Lastly, it was common to see 2 more types of mobile formations on the battlefield. The first was your typical line of battle, a battalion presenting a wide front to maximize firepower. On the march, it was hard to control and keep together, especially over harsh terrain under fire. A less cumbersome formation was the column. In column, soldiers found it easier to keep formation. Secondly, it could be used to launch concentrated assaults with the bayonet. However, it did not allow for greater use of firepower. If a formation needed to fire back, the men needed to take the precious time to form back into line of battle, a difficult task to complete in combat.